Hi, my name is September Krueger, and I am an art teacher and also a textile artist. And I'm going to show you some basic steps for putting a print on a piece of cloth. We're going to be making a design to print onto a t-shirt with a really basic method using a stencil. So you are going to be creating a design based on Planet Money's journey of a t-shirt. So this is my design for my t-shirt. You'll make a connection to my robot with the needle after you listen to the first podcast, and I'm going to show you the basic steps for creating an image like this. On the t-shirt, one of the things you're going to have to consider is separating your design into areas of color. And when you make your design, think about large areas of color. You can cut some fine detail. It's just a little more complicated than if you have large areas of color in your design. So you're going to have your basic t-shirt. The design is going to be cut from freezer paper. And then we're going to use a couple of different materials for putting color onto the cloth. There is a concentrated color that we will add to a base that is used to print with. That base has a nice soft hand, so you can print with acrylics, but this is designed for textiles, so it feels soft. It's not crunchy like acrylic sometimes feels on fabric. And then we can also add in some details with a textile paint. And this is something that you can apply simply with a brush, and you can get some finer details like the thread that you see on one side of the design. So here's my design, and you can see I already gave myself a few guidelines for areas that I want to separate. I knew that I wanted the t-shirt in a different color from the rest of my robot, and I traced this design out on two different pieces of freezer paper. Where these lines are in Sharpie, these are the lines that I would then cut. So you are going to need an X-Acto knife for doing the cutting. You can protect the edge with an eraser. That's what you see on the tip there. And then you will need brushes of a couple of different sizes for actually filling in the areas in the stencil. So I have already on the cutting board the first area that I'm going to be printing. This is the blue that you saw in the robot, and you can see everywhere where there were the bold lines with the Sharpie, I cut around those lines very carefully with the X-Acto knife. In order to get the freezer paper to stick to the fabric, you simply iron it. So I'm going to turn my iron on, let it heat up just a little bit. And the other thing to remember is that the freezer paper has two sides. It has one side that feels more like paper and one side that is shiny. The shiny side is what is going to stick to the fabric, and the paper side is what you are going to draw on. It doesn't take very long for the paper to adhere to the fabric, but you do want to make sure you get a nice, good seal. It's a cotton t-shirt, so you don't want it to be any hotter than a cotton setting, and I actually have my iron a little cooler than that. Now for our demonstration, I am working flat on this piece of cloth. When we are working on a t-shirt, you want to make sure that you insert a piece of cardboard between the layers of fabric so that when you print, your ink stays on this layer and it doesn't go through to the back of your shirt. Another general rule to think about with where this design is going to fall on your body is about 3 fingers away from the neckline. So once I have my design ironed down with the freezer paper, I've got the areas cut out with the areas of color that I want for my first part. I'm going to get my textile ink and a little spatula, or you can use a spoon. And you can actually put some areas of color down on the freezer paper and squeegee them into place, or you can simply take a brush and fill in those areas of color. The more complicated your design is, the more control you'll have if you brush in the areas of your design. When you're brushing, notice that I'm trying to pull in so that I don't get paint going underneath the freezer paper. It makes a pretty good seal, but it helps to also pull in from the edge as you're filling in those areas. And again, you're going to notice some areas in the design that are not cut. Those areas are where I'm going to get the second color applied. When you're coming up with your colors for your design, think about contrast. So I'm not only thinking about the colors that I want in the robot, I'm also thinking about those colors that I would have in the background as well. Okay, get the last of the body here. Every fabric is different in the way that it feels for the paint to go onto the cloth. You want to make sure that you are brushing it enough so that it is sinking into the fibers, but not so much that you're stretching or pulling the fabric as you go along. And you could also do something with more than one color. So in every area of this stencil, if I wanted to do something where I'm brushing two colors together at the same time, I can do two colors instead of one flat color. Okay, and one last foot. This dries fairly quickly, but if I were to lift away the freezer paper right now, it would still be a little sticky. So I'm going to get my hair dryer out and dry this a little bit before I move on to the next stencil and the next color. So I have all of my areas painted in with the stencil, and then I can just remove the freezer paper. It should peel right away. And you can see anywhere that I didn't want color, the freezer paper was able to block that. And now I can add in my second color with my t-shirt. And along with that part of the design, I'm going to show you one other thing that you will need to consider. So in the design of my robot, he is holding a needle. And I want to make sure the eye of the needle is something that we see in the design. So when I cut out that needle, I'm going to want to save that tiny piece of paper because that is going to be white. In the final print. So anywhere like that that you know you want to reserve the color of the shirt, make sure you hold on to that piece of freezer paper. So I left that intact. I got most of it cut out. I'm going to cut the rest of the way off here. cut out the eye. When you're using your X-Acto knife, you want to be very careful to be pulling away from your hand. And this is why you can see you can have a lot of control with it, but very tiny areas in a design are a little bit trickier to cut. Okay. So I'm going to line up my t-shirt. Want to make sure that it is right in between the two arms, and then also have the openings for where the eyes are going to be. Get my iron on. One of the other things that you're going to use the iron for is setting the ink into the fabric. So in order to make this ink washable, so that you can wear your t-shirt and wash it over and over again, you have to heat set it with an iron. And that'll be the very last thing that you do after you're done with all of your components. Okay, make sure those edges are down. And then I want to get that tiny eye of my needle. And you notice that I wrote myself a note so that I would remember to save that piece. That might be something that you need to do. Make sure it's stuck. Okay. So I've got a little bit of green for my t-shirt, and I'm going to do this the same way. Just brushing that color in. Coming in from the edge. Making sure that I get the paint down into the cloth. That. And then that needle. And you can even use the stiff stencil brushes if you would like, especially if you have a thin area like this. You can just daub the paint into that area. My eyes are done with a textile paint called Lumiere. And this paint is a little bit heavier than the other textile paint that we mix the colors, but what's fun about this is it comes in some metallics. So I thought some metallic color would be good for the eyes of my robot. So same thing, just dabbing that color into that area that I left open. The other reason that I'm using Lumiere is that I'm putting a color on top of another color, and sometimes the transparency of our base means that that other color will shine through, but this is nice and opaque, so it sits on the surface of the color underneath. Okay, and I'll hit the hairdryer and dry this layer. So this is one last step. Something like this is optional that you can have in your design. If you remember in my T-shirt, I have a background that's in place as well. So I could leave my design like this. Let me reveal the eye of my needle, sorry. But I had my design looking like this, and I thought I really want some more contrast. So what I did with my T-shirt was I traced on one more piece of freezer paper one robot that was the entire set all together on a piece of freezer paper, and I used this to create a resist, and then I created a block around him with masking tape for background color. So this is a continuous piece of robot, and you can see he's a little off. This was from my original design. So we'll get a little bit of a shadow on this one. And then with something as simple as masking tape, I also created a resist. So many of the materials that we've been using today are pretty low tech. The freezer paper is our primary resist that you can cut designs from, but you can also use something as simple as masking tape. And so this masking tape is going to give me a border. And then that will allow me to have a background area in my design. And the beauty of the freezer paper is that, again, you can cut almost anything. You can layer different elements in your design because the ink is somewhat transparent. So you can have things that overlap. You'll see a little bit of that overlap when I put this background color in. And when I put the background color in, I'm going to use an old card. So we have lots of these old cards lying around. And I'm going to give myself a little bit of paper here so that you can see, because this will give me some ink to pull into the design, but I don't want it to get onto my fabric. And I'm just going to use that card, and I'm going to kind of squeegee it right into this background area. So you can put it onto the masking tape as well. You just want to make sure that you don't go into your design area. And just like before, you want to try to pull away from the edges of your freezer paper so that it doesn't get underneath your design if you can. And again, you can see how you could swirl a couple of colors together as you put this background in. I'm going to hold that a little closer because you can see on the other side I got some ink onto my fabric. And a little goes a long way, so you don't have to use a ton of the ink or paint in order to cover the cloth. Okay. And make sure it's nice and flat. I don't want any of those ridges in there. And I want to make sure it's evenly covered, or as even as I want it, because you could put it in there with a brush so that there's some texture. Dry it a little bit with the hair dryer. And then we'll pull off that tape. And you can see it made a nice resist for a background color. And now my robot pops even more. So you're going to want to think about the colors that you have in your design on paper, but then you can even modify some things as we go along. There we go. So I've got 3 colors in place, and I can go back as with my other design, and I can paint in the fine line for thread or other details that I want on my composition. So those are all of the basics for putting together your design with the layers of freezer paper. I can also add in a couple of fine details with the Lumiere. That is the fabric paint, so just like you saw in the original design, that thread, I can go in with a brush and add in some fine details to finish off my composition.